What's up, guys? Oh, I gotta get some lights on. Let me get some lights on so that you guys can actually see me. Here I am putting all this stuff together, and we don't even have the appropriate lights on. I promise this will be good. I promise. This is me and my one-man crew making this happen. So hopefully, you guys see my face. It's difficult as it is to look at. All right, so what's up, guys? My name is Gus. I'm here in Florida, and this is the Anomaly Podcast. At least that's the name of it for now. We may change the name. I'm not really sure. Normally, I'm here with a guest, but today it's just going to be me. I took some notes down on some things that I kind of wanted to talk about that I found interesting. And you know, the big thing on the news is what's happening with the economy. The tariffs, in particular, have been a really big impact into what could potentially happen with the economy. And it's nerve-wracking trying to figure out what to do. I mean, as a business owner myself, I'm trying to figure out, like, you know, how is this going to ultimately impact my business? And, you know, I'm a service-based business. I do commercial real estate. So, you know, how is this going to ultimately impact what is to come? And we're seeing a lot of, from the real estate side, we're seeing a lot of just sort of wait and see kind of situations where, you know, you got people that are just, you know, nervous to make a move. And whenever there's uncertainty, that's pretty common. We typically see, make sure we have actually, okay. We typically see during times of uncertainty, people are hesitant to make a decision, make a move, because they don't know what's going to happen. They don't know what the outcome is going to be. They don't know what that's going to look like for them. And they're nervous to make a decision on how to proceed. So for the point of this podcast is really just try to, I guess, have a regular conversation. I don't proclaim to be an expert of any kind. I just do research on things and try to understand, like, what's going on and how that's ultimately going to help me. So I'm going to use some of my notes here to kind of talk about a few things that are, I think, important to note. So, you know, one of the things that it seems these tariffs are really focused heavily on what's going on in China. Obviously, Trump initially put tariffs on all countries, but it seems like that was really a sort of a short-term strategy to get countries to come to the table to discuss how to deal with China, because a lot of the tariffs that were put in China, and, you know, historically from other administrations as well as from his previous administration, they basically circumvented them by just running them through other countries like Vietnam, like Mexico, so on and so forth. So it seems to me like the idea was to prevent China from essentially doing that. And that's understandable, because obviously China is a major, you know, a global power as it relates to manufacturing. I mean, they obviously have a significant dominance in the manufacturing sector. They accounted for 29% of the global manufacturing output, in 2023. So that's a lot. Like, they were almost a third of all manufacturing on the planet came from China, which I think is a pretty significant. I think it's hard to even wrap my head around that, but the fact that they accounted for more than 30% of all things manufactured on the planet is pretty impactful. So, you know, they ultimately had a trade surplus in 2024. So China's trade surplus reached a record 992 billion, and that was all driven by their exports. So, you know, their manufacturing position is pretty substantial. Now, I guess the question is, like, how ultimately they are, you know, doing that is that in a way that's actually, like, that's reasonable or fair to other nations. And I think that's where one of the challenges, at least that's one of the claims that the United States is making, is that they have not been fair in the way that they do business. So, and not to say that there should be, business can't always be fair. Sometimes there's usually some kind of unfair advantage. I think one of the challenges with China in particular is that they have they essentially subsidize a lot of their manufacturing, which, I mean, hey, that's the way that they run their country. Okay. But they also don't have, they don't allow access to their court system. So if there's any dispute about things that they're manufacturing, there's no access to their court system. They don't really have like really human rights elements instilled in their manufacturing capacity, at least not to the extent that we have ours. Or that you would consider first world countries to have. And that happens across other countries too. But so I don't know that I would necessarily blame them. They're just trying to do whatever they can to get ahead. So I understand that to some degree. I don't agree with it, but I understand where they're coming from. But the fact that we don't have access to their court system is kind of problematic, because if they decide that they want to manufacture something, or they want to steal something from us, there's no way for us to have any recourse in their country, but they have access to ours. So if something like that were to happen in reverse, they can come into our nation, we give them access to our court system, and they would be able to effectively make a case against any company that was essentially stealing from any of their or corporations. So the ability to be able to do that for intellectual property and trademarks and stuff like that is powerful stuff, because if anyone could make Nike shoes, then it takes away from Nike's brand, especially if it's not necessarily made at the same quality or whatever the case may be, right? So it becomes problematic to Nike, and that's not really fair to Nike. That's why we have sort of these intellectual property rights and stuff like that, is to ensure that the original brand is ultimately in control of their brand, at least for a certain period of time. And then after some period of time, maybe that opens up, or whatever the case, but at least there should be some kind of some kind of rules in place to prevent just any company from for me, just kind of putting a Nike swoosh on this cup and saying, hey, this is a Nike cup. But obviously I'm not Nike. That would be problematic if I were to do something like that. So I think that's one of the big things, is that what makes it a little bit unfair is that, they have the ability to be able to essentially take a lot of our intellectual property and then make things and do things that, and we have no recourse for that. So a company that essentially creates that here in the United States, and then it goes to China, then China could effectively, because they are, they don't have the same wage requirements that we have, they could essentially steal ideas and then recreate them, putting American businesses out of business and essentially running with something that they never created, which that's not a fair practice. I mean, I think you could, it would be hard. I would be hard pressed to see anyone who sees that as being reasonable. So that's one of the challenges that we're seeing. So obviously we're seeing escalating trade tensions, specifically between the United States and China, which is one of the big things that we're kind of running into right now. Now, one thing that we are seeing, or at least one thing it seems like it's not being really reported on, which I was really surprised. I had to do some digging to kind of find this, but apparently there are a lot of factory closures that are happening in China. So they're trying to double down on manufacturing, but a lot of the, manufacturing factories are effectively closing down. Apparently, they've been heightened. The heightened tariffs have led to widespread factory shutdowns in China, particularly affecting small and medium-sized enterprises. This is based from the New York Post. So that's that arguably liberal news source reporting on that, and they wouldn't be necessarily write anything that would be favorable towards the current administration. So that's one of a few different sources. So there's a lot of worker unrest that's happening over there, because those workers are not getting paid, because there's not orders that are actually being done from those manufacturing plants and factories. So there's definitely some disarray that's happening over there, and I'm surprised that there's not more discussion around that. Now, one of the things that that's currently in place are sort of diversification efforts. So Chinese manufacturing are seeking to relocate operations to countries like Vietnam and Mexico, right? This is kind of one way that they effectively work around our tariffs. They create a manufacturing plant in Vietnam, for example, and it seems like at least what I've been reading, they will actually not even hire Vietnamese people or even Mexican people in Mexico to actually work the plant. They will bring in Chinese workers to work the plant. So it's still Chinese owned, it's still Chinese operated. It's not even providing labor for the local people. So, the local Mexicans that need work, they can't even work in those factories because they bring in Chinese workers to actually work in those factories. So even from the perspective of, hey, they're bringing jobs to that country is not even a good argument because they tend not to do that. So they're trying to diversify where they're actually sending their manufactured goods from to avoid tariffs, which is one of the reasons why it seems like it's one of the reasons why they put tariffs across all the countries, which again doesn't seem to be one of the I guess they talk about it a little bit. I've heard a little bit about that in some of the more traditional news media, but I thought that was really interesting that they're really trying to make efforts to do that so that they can kind of get around some of these challenges. On the flip side of that, we're also seeing the United States are also trying to, I would say businesses are trying to find alternative routes for where manufacturing can come from. If China's not going to be manufacturing the widgets, who would be doing that? One of the things that kind of came up, and I don't know if this is it might come out later in my notes, but one of the things that kind of came up that I thought was really interesting is that India kind of stepped up, and if you've been paying attention or if not, but there's a BRICS alliance that was sort of in play for a little while, and I was a little nervous about the BRICS alliance, but it looks like that BRICS alliance is kind of falling apart. And what this was supposed to be was an alliance of nations. BRICS stands for the nations that initially initiated this alliance, which was Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, right? So these countries were essentially kind of creating a new, I would say, trade alliance where they could trade goods and services, specifically in energy, between themselves and any other nations that wanted to join. Part of the conversation was to essentially create a competing currency that would go up against the United States dollar because it's the reserve currency of the world right now. And for a little while, I had a little anxiety about it because, while, there's a good argument for how this would benefit the world at large. It would definitely be at our detriment, the United States. So I'm a little bit divided on on that because it would have a sort of greater good kind of feel for the world potentially, but would be at the detriment of the United States. So, but that whole alliance, that was sort of in play for a minute. Has started to fall apart. One of the major players in that alliance was India, and India has just, made essentially I don't know if there are full agreements in place, but there's certainly clear negotiations as it relates to India and the United States to effectively have India take over a lot of the manufacturing capacity that China currently is doing. So, one of the things that there's at least talks about, and I don't know if this is necessarily finalized, is that India and the United States will effectively have a zero tariff policy going both ways, which and then the exchange for that is that India will effectively be the manufacturing powerhouse for a lot of the products that otherwise were being manufactured in China. So this sounds like this might be an interesting play, as it relates to how the United States is going to be able, because we're such a consumer nation, how are we going to get our goods? Because so many of our goods, like if China's making 30% of the goods that are created and we are the largest consumer nation on the globe, then that means that the majority of the things that we're getting in the United States are coming from China. So if that's the case, then the fact that we've effectively put a tariff on China so high that it makes it nearly impossible to really buy wares from China and be able to sell them in the United States where people would actually buy them. That's obviously creating a challenge. How are we going to replace that? What are we going to replace that with? We probably can't afford to manufacture all of those widgets ourselves. Like we're too expensive for ourselves to manufacture a lot of the things that are manufactured in China. So India, being a country that's similar in size and has a huge labor force, and a lot of their infrastructure has started to get built out. There may be an opportunity there for India to effectively become a major manufacturing powerhouse. To play in the sandbox, as it were. So, and if that relationship, turns out to be good, which the president of India and the president of the United States right now have really good relations, have a really good relationship. There's a good possibility that it is going to work out, and India will effectively be the manufacturing powerhouse that the United States will essentially rely on. What I don't know is what's the time frame for them to be able to build out the manufacturing capacity to do these things, because obviously you'd have to have businesses there that would be able to essentially do this kind of manufacturing. You'd have to build out the infrastructure and power grid to be able to support that kind of manufacturing. Maybe they have that enough to be able to do that, to build enough manufacturing plants, to have them, filled with both labor that knows what they're doing, that, they're going to need to do some training. There's going to be maybe there's some automation that's in there as well, that's mixed in. So the combination of some automation so there's a lot of money that would have to go into India to, I think, build that out. And there's also a time element that we got to think about too. So in the interim, there may be some difficulty in getting a lot of manufactured goods, especially if China is not really going to be the main place where we get our goods from. So some goods will just disappear because China may have been one of the only manufacturers of the thing. Or it just is taking a long time to move that manufacturing to another location that's not China. So there may be just a gap for goods, which is going to be interesting. And that's going to be, I think that there's definitely going to be some pain here in the United States. And I guess it's a question of how are we as a nation going to be able to handle that pain. And that is one of my main concerns, is that, it's been difficult as it is, as a country, with the way our economics has been. And it's been, sort of, a lot of it has kind of dug out a lot of the sort of middle class, workers that essentially make up the lion's share of our population, and move them outside of what would have otherwise been considered sort of comfortably middle class. And that's a little scary, because obviously we don't want more people going into poverty or having to deal with more debt or anything like that. So I don't know what the pain point is ultimately going to be for that. So domestic consumption challenges here. China aims to pivot towards domestic consumption to sustain economic growth. So it seems like China's going to try and try to get its own people to buy a lot of the stuff that it makes. But I think it makes way too many things, and their economy, the people that are in China, there's not enough people that are in that make enough money to be able to consume the stuff that they make. I don't know how much that's going to ultimately help them. Obviously it'll probably help a little, but that probably means that they'll probably have to, they're already subsidizing the manufacturers. Will they have to subsidize their citizens to be able to afford the things that they're manufacturing? I'm wondering if they had to do that, like, is that still a net positive, or is it just a facade? If they're subsidizing their manufacturing and they're subsidizing their citizens to buy the things that are manufactured, then is there really a boost happening, or is it just a facade to keep the citizens from, rioting against the country and getting into disarray? I feel like that's what it would be, but I'm not an expert here, but that's what it sounds like it could be. Anyways, efforts to boost domestic spending are hindered by factors such as high savings rate, limited social welfare, and economic uncertainty. So this kind of goes back to what I'm saying is that that the the economic uncertainty, I think, is probably the biggest challenge, I would say, that's there, that people are just unsure of what's going to go on. So the outlook here is basically, I'm going to read it here. The ongoing trade war and internal economic challenges suggest a period of uncertainty for China's manufacturing sector. While the government is implementing strategies to mitigate these issues, the effectiveness of such measures remains to be seen. So this is part of what I don't know, like how that's going to play out. It does seem like obviously China's putting up a front that everything's going great. We do the same thing. Countries usually don't talk about how much struggle they're going through. And both the United States and China are trying to show face, right? They're trying to show off how much they don't need the other. And right now, I think both nations are sort of intertwined. We rely heavily on Chinese manufactured goods, and they rely heavily on our consuming of those manufactured goods. I think this is something that's hurting both of us. It's probably hurting them more than us. The thing is though, I think that they probably have more tolerance for pain than we do. Here in the United States, we don't have a big tolerance for pain, and in the same way that China does. And I think part of that may be cultural. Part of that may be the fact that we're a more advanced nation, so we're used to a lot of creature comforts that most of China may not necessarily be accustomed to. And then I think that there is with regard to uh, you know being able to deal with pain, is that we're a much louder voice, and our society is a louder voice because our governance is a democracy that allows us to have a voice and be able to vocalize our concerns. While there can be arguments as to how much of a voice we have, that's another argument to be had. But in theory, we're a democracy that has a voice to be able to kind of vocalize some of the concerns that we have, and that can ultimately sway where the political sway may go, like what direction we may decide to move in, because if there's enough upheaval from the citizens of the United States, then and it doesn't require a lot because of the way that our governance is set up. Like, it doesn't require us to riot to be able to do that, right? We can, as long as there's strong enough voices in place, making enough noise, there is going to be sort of a shift on how we deal with something like this, right? So how long can we deal with the pain? Where China, on the other hand, because it's really more of an authoritarian type of regime, they can dictate like the pain that they're going to tolerate, and will really it will have to come to complete civil unrest before that government may make a change in their strategic positioning. So that's what I mean when I say that we don't have the same tolerance as a nation as China does, is because the citizens have more of a voice here. So we can vocalize some of the things that we are not happy with, and that can ultimately have a resounding effect on how the government moves. Where China, on the other hand, their people may vocalize some things, but their governance doesn't necessarily either even listen to them, or sometimes will even silence them. And they would have to get to a point of full civil unrest before that government would feel the need to have to make a shift in their position, if they were to even make one. So there's just a different way of governance, and different people might say which one's good or bad, or whatever the case may be. I personally like variations on democracy. So I think that any kind of democratic system is going to be, better than any authoritarian system. Even and again, there are some things that authoritarian systems do benefit from. They benefit from moving more swiftly. They can make decisions faster, but they it's highly reliant on who the person in charge is. And if the person in charge is not benevolent, then that could be problematic for that nation, right? So, but even that is not, moving swiftly is not necessarily good for a country. You don't want countries that are just kind of switching too fast, right? You kind of want to be a big ship, and you want things to kind of take a little bit of time to ensure that, hey, the decision that was made is actually going to be okay, and we have time to kind of shift things back if you turned it too sharply one way or the other. So I think even with the things that are happening with the current administration, yes, it feels like things are moving super like lightning fast, but at the end of the day, there are still processes in place, right? That things have to kind of flow a certain way, and I feel like, because it's a big ship, there's still time to kind of make adjustments. Now, some of the pros and cons to all of this. There's a lot of talk about what can happen, what can't happen. The truth of the matter is, I don't think anybody really knows, right? I think there's a lot of projections of what is going to happen, but really we don't really know what's going to happen. This is all new, new waters. And I say that not that we haven't done tariffs before or anything like that, but our whole global system is different now than it's ever been before, and the players are in different positions than they've ever been before. So this is definitely uncharted waters. I mean, there may be some similar situations that may have happened in the 70s and in the 30s, but like this is not the same. Like there's definitely new dynamics that are happening here that didn't exist before. So some of the pros and cons that we're going to be looking at here as it relates to what's happening with these tariffs. So it does encourage domestic manufacturing. So the tariffs make importing goods more expensive, giving U.S.-based manufacturers a price advantage. I don't know that it will be necessarily a price advantage, but at least some equilibrium. It also encourages countries that are manufacturing outside the United States to potentially come here to the United States and manufacture. The question is that really going to be a net benefit in terms of job creation? I think it depends on what they're manufacturing and how much automation is actually going to be built into that manufacturing. So if you bring a plant here and the entire plant is just sort of automated in terms of manufacturing, it creates jobs maybe for the building of the plant, but then the only jobs then after that are going to be the maintenance crew for the automation. It's not going to necessarily be workers putting pins in plastic elements or anything like that, right? I don't know. The idea of bringing manufacturing here is good as long as it's not manufacturing that's just automated. Because if it's just automated, I don't know that we're not necessarily going to see more jobs. That's the idea. That's the hope, that we'll see more higher paying jobs coming here for manufacturing. I do think that any kind of manufacturing that does come to the United States will probably have to be skilled manufacturing. So I can see, or like just more complex things. We're talking about cars, planes, trains, machines, right? Building more complex, I guess widgets. I guess you can call them widgets, right? It seems like that is probably before we really see any movement on that. I mean, because there's so much infrastructure that's needed to build that out, we may not see, even if it brings manufacturing here, we may not see that for another 3 to 5 years, right? Because they still have to build their plants, they got to train people, they got to start the process. Like there's a whole lot of things that kind of go in line. They got to first find the property before they even build and all that good stuff. So there's a number of different things. There's a lot of capital expense to have to go there, that has to go into building such a thing. Is that capital expense, does that outpace? The question is like, is it more expensive to just pay the 10%, let's say it's a 10% tariff coming in, versus the cost of building a manufacturing plant here, and then over the course of 3 to 5 years getting it all up and running, and then building things here without the tariff? Like, is it worth that? And I don't know the answer. I guess it depends on like how much money is being transacted. you know, versus what the cost of building this infrastructure and putting workers in it, what that cost is going to be. So there'll definitely be a short-term cost, and will that short-term cost ultimately be beneficial in being able to sell things here in the United States, because that 10% tariff that they don't have to pay now it makes sense for them to make here. And I think a lot of that is going to be dependent on what they're manufacturing. Obviously, our workforce is more expensive here than other countries. So, you know, um, is that something that's like we need to? Will that cause a concern? I guess we would have to, that it's hard to explain. I guess hard to get into it. Is like there's so many different variables that are a part of this manufacturing, like, puzzle. Figuring out, like, let's say, for example, we're looking at Vietnam as an example, and they're building widgets in Vietnam, and the cost to build widgets in Vietnam is less because their labor force is less expensive. Maybe their materials they can get over there, they maybe can either make themselves, or they have access to those materials without, let's say, a 10% tariff that for materials that will be coming here. And then, they build them, and then they ship them here, and there's a cost of shipping, right? So the question is that 10% tariff going to be more expensive than bringing that same manufacturing plant here in the United States, building that plant, hiring Americans to do that work, which are going to be more expensive to hire Americans to do that work? And with all of the benefits and minimum wage elements, and all the requirements for the manufacturing property itself, that we have in terms of zoning and all that good stuff, right? Is it going to be more expensive to still move them here, or is it going to be less expensive? Is it going to be worth it for someone to invest that money, or just keep it offshore? I don't know the answer to that. That's going to be interesting to see how that actually plays out, because there's definitely some things to consider there. The only way that I think it makes sense is if you're doing something that's going to be highly complex and it's difficult for a Vietnam to make, right? It's just challenging for them to make it because they need more skilled labor, or there's certain machinery that requires certain kind of maintenance that they don't necessarily have the infrastructure for. Maybe there's power requirements or something of that nature, where our infrastructure is what allows us to be able to build those at a high level, right? So that's where I think where we may be able to thrive. So the other pro that comes from the United States having these tariffs is it's reducing our dependency on China. And really, this is really to diversify the supply chain, not necessarily to bring all those jobs here, but to also have other nations that we're relying on for goods. So if we run into any kind of a scuffle with, China in the future, they can't hold that up against us as a weapon. They can't weaponize their manufacturing against us now, and they can't do things like taking, intellectual property and stuff like that. So. And if they were to do that, we would have the ability to say, okay, we're just going to stop using you. And it's not going to be painful for us. We'll just use India or Vietnam or Mexico or something like that to manufacture those goods because they respect our IP. So I do think that's a good idea to sort of diversify where our manufacturing, like our products, come from. I think that's a good idea. I think this is one of those things that's going to take some time. Again, we're looking at probably 2 to 5 years window before those nations are able to kind of fill the gaps, because they're going to have to probably increase their capacity. So it's going to be interesting to see that. Now, I think the idea also here is to protect critical industries, and specifically semiconductors is one of the big ones that right now all the semiconductors in the world are built in Taiwan, and that's fine. We have a great relationship with Taiwan. The problem is that Taiwan and China do not have a great relationship, and if things were to go south, and there was a issue between Taiwan and China, the United States would have to get involved in that, and that could potentially be problematic just from a conflict perspective. And we don't really want to get in. I don't think it would be a good idea for us to get too heavy into any kind of military conflict, especially with a country like China, even though uh, we do have technological and military superiority over them, they are still a big nation. And, it would be very painful for us to be in any kind of conflict with a nation of that size. So it would be silly for anyone to presume that just because we are the most sophisticated military in the world, that we can just come in and just kind of dominate over any other nation. I mean, we may win, but everybody loses, right? So like, we don't want to get into a conflict with China. We don't want to get into a conflict with Russia. Like, these are countries that are massive, and they have, and China as a manufacturing hub. I mean, we did this in the 30s, right? When in the 40s, when World War II came in, we just converted all of our manufacturing plants that used to make like toys and stuff into military plants. So if China is manufacturing 30% of all the goods that come to the market, that they very easily can turn those manufacturing plants into like war machine creating plants. Like that's a thing. That's a very real thing. We did that, right? So it's not a good idea to get into a military conflict with them. That would just be silly. So we can't just strong arm China into doing things militarily. It would not be a good idea to do that. So I definitely think economics is really the better way to kind of address that. But they're adjacent, obviously, to Taiwan. They have still make a claim to Taiwan, while Taiwan, claims its independence. So if there were any kind of real, if they really wanted to make a move towards Taiwan, they're right next door. So it would be difficult for us to even defend Taiwan even if we wanted to. So that's a whole other animal. But one of the things that is good is that semiconductors are starting to come here for manufacturing, which will allow us to be able to make our own semiconductors, which I think is a good idea, especially because semiconductors play such a pivotal role in all of our military and all of our technology, which big tech is really one of the strongest sectors for the United States. We're just really advanced in terms of our ability to provide big tech to the rest of the world. So I think that semiconductors is that definitely needs to come here. Other things that are also that we also need to be paying attention to as it relates to critical industries is steel. We used to be one of the top steel manufacturers in the world, and that's essentially disappeared. So bringing steel back to the United States, I think, is a smart move. Hopefully, that will impact our ability to make steel more affordable. I don't know if that's going to be the case, but that would be nice if that could be the case. But we should be able to make our own steel. Steel is going to be important if we ever run into any kind of conflicts militarily. We need steel. And if there's anyone who could stop us from being able to get access to steel because it comes from another place, that would be very problematic. Medical supplies also is another thing that we get from other nations. So, again, same thing. We want to make sure that we have medical supplies that are being manufactured here. Obviously, we can get medical supplies from other places, but some of the more complex machinery and stuff like that, it would be good for us to be able to make it here if we can, if that makes sense. Hopefully it does, right? I know medical supplies can be rather expensive, so I feel like there's enough margin in there for us to be able to manufacture that stuff here. So these are things that hopefully we as a nation can start having a little bit more of that onshore. Not to say that we won't still have offshore options as well, but at least have an option that's here in the United States. I think that's a good idea. I think that's definitely a good pro, as it were. So this trade I guess we're calling it a trade war now. It leverages trade as geopolitical pressure. So economic pressure on China may deter aggressive actions in foreign policy and trade manipulation. So this is the idea. Whether it actually does it, we have yet to see that. Obviously there is some pressure on China, and we are. It seems like the United States is trying to negotiate with other nations to also put pressure on China, which it's probably a good idea, especially if they're not playing fair. If they're not doing things that are fair to other nations either, then we should probably say, hey, listen, you can play in the sandbox, but you got to play fair. play fair. That's all we're asking, right? If you're going to make a manufacturing plant in Vietnam, hire Vietnamese people, let the Vietnamese people work those manufacturing plants. Same thing with Mexico, right? Like it could be Chinese owned, but have the local people actually working it, right? And follow the rules of whatever the local, the local governance dictates as it relates to how you have to, keep up with all your protocols for the building, for the workers, all that good stuff. So I do think that that's not unfair. We're probably going to see that. That's something that doesn't require necessarily physical, like logistics. That's more just coming to an agreement for how all the players are going to play. So that could happen sooner than later. I think that could probably happen within a year. So it'd be interesting to see how that ultimately plays out, but everyone has to be willing to play ball. But that can happen within a year or two. So still, that's a year or two of pain that, we as a nation would feel, other countries could potentially feel. So there's definitely some challenges there. And then the theory is that it could support some job growth in selected industries. So there is a potential, like steel, for example, is something that's going to require human labor. So, and I think car manufacturing would be human labor, more complex manufacturing. I don't think we would be in the t-shirt making business, right? Or in the cup making business or something like that, like unless they're like special cups that, do something magical. So, we're not going to be able to compete for those kinds of things. But for more complex things, I think we could definitely play ball in there. And if we can bring that kind of manufacturing here, that would create more jobs for the United States. And I'd be very excited to see that. Now, again, this goes back to how long is it going to take for them to actually build the infrastructure to be able to have those jobs in the first place. Again, we're probably looking at 2 to 5 years as our window. And I wish I had I wish I could tell. I mean, I wish I could predict something sooner or like tighter, but it's hard to predict that. Like you gotta, I'm going to assume here that if the administration is trying to incentivize that, they're probably going to also provide additional incentives for businesses that raise their hand and say, hey, we're going to build here, and offer maybe some tax incentives or maybe some subsidies to help them move things along, try to, put them on the fast track to getting past the permit process and stuff like that. So it doesn't take, 4 years just to get something approved. I'm assuming that they're going to go through that. My hope is that if that is the case, that they're going to try to fast track these manufacturing plants so that number is closer to 2 years versus 5 years. And again, I'm assuming that also because I know part of what the administration wants to do, specifically Donald Trump. I think he genuinely is trying to create a legacy. Whether you agree with whether that legacy is right or wrong, I don't know. I don't know that I agree with the way that he's doing it, but I think that's his intention. And I think his hope is that when he leaves office, things will be better so he can raise his hand and say, see, I did that. So my guess is that he's going to be pushing to try to get all this stuff rocking and rolling before he's out of office. So I'm going to guess that he's probably going to do everything in his power to try to fast track any of these job making, manufacturing, beneficial items that he has some influence over. He's going to try to see if he can fast track that stuff so that he can leave office with being able to say that he did an amazing job. So I think that is his intention. So I would be surprised if, manufacturers said, hey, I want to build here, and then there's no support from the federal government to get that to, effectively get them to the end result, which is them actually manufacturing goods here. So those are some of the pros that it seems like this tariff may put in place. Now, some of the cons, there are definitely some cons that we're going to see here, and one of those things is higher consumer pricing. So, it's effectively a tax on imports, which typically does trail down in most cases to the consumer. So, that is going to be happening almost immediately. So I think we're at the tail end of the manufacturing pipeline in terms of deliveries. So May and June is going to be sort of, I think, some of the first months where we're going to really start seeing things not existing on the shelf, right? There will be certain things that they'll either be replaced by something else or they just won't exist on the shelf, right? And stores will probably not leave empty shelves, but they'll probably just either extend the inventory of stuff that they are able to get, or they'll replace the widget or the food item or whatever that's getting imported with something else from somewhere else at a different price point, right? So we're likely to start seeing changes at the grocery store and at the I would say more at like your retail stores in this month and probably next month, right? Is when we start seeing that, and that will probably progress as we go through the year, and things will probably start getting more and more expensive as some people will still buy things from China or parts from China, and they have to pass some of that expense along in order for them to keep their margins reasonable. Some of that is small businesses usually have really thin margins, so they kind of have to do that. Large businesses may be able to get away with keeping their pricing pretty much the same, though their stockholders may not be happy with that, so they may end up pushing those prices up just to keep profitability, their margins the same as what they saw before. So this may be a good this may end up being an opportunity for smaller businesses to really compete if they can afford the smaller margins, where the larger companies, may not want to. The smaller companies may have to in order to stay competitive, or maybe even find other ways to provide value for what they're providing. People spend more money on things, right? To the same thing, right? Like people will spend more money on a pair of shoes that have a certain brand versus a pair of shoes that don't have that certain brand. And there is, and if they're, and the shoes may be almost identical, right? So people are willing to pay more money for certain ideas, right? For certain things. And I think that this is an opportunity for us as business owners to figure out like what can we bring to the table that helps us to establish our brand, that people will be more willing to work with us or to buy our widget versus buying the cheaper version of it, right? So that we're not commoditized. So we see this all the time and all across the different things that you buy, right? Like you can buy Doritos, or you can buy the knockoff version of Doritos, and the knockoff version is cheaper. I mean, it is. A bag of Doritos is like $6, and you can probably get the knockoff for like $3 to $4. So why not buy the knockoff? Maybe the Doritos taste better, right? They have sort of similar seasonings, but the Doritos taste better. Maybe that's what it is. Maybe the whatever it is, like this is an opportunity for business owners to figure out like how can we provide more value so that people are willing to pay the higher price point, right? Because the likelihood is that there is going to be a higher price point that local business is probably going to have to charge. And if other manufacturers like the Walmarts and the Targets of the world are able to provide the same widget for less, what is the benefit to working or buying the widget from the local business? I think that this is an opportunity that, how can you create, part of it may be the experience. Maybe when you go in the store, there's a certain experience that you get. I mean, Apple's notorious for doing that at a really high level, with their Apple stores and stuff like that. You see some of these sort of higher end brands will do that with their stores and stuff like that, where there's a whole experience that's built in to buying the widget. So I would say that there's definitely going to be some challenges here, but I think there's also if you can get a better quality thing, like if you can figure out how to get a better quality version of the thing that you sell, and then put something behind that, I think that could also potentially be an opportunity. But ultimately, there's going to be challenges. A lot of business owners are going to struggle because the pricing is just going to have to go up, and consumers are going to be much more vigilant with their spending because everything's going to get more expensive. So I definitely think there's going to be some challenges there, and we're likely to see that over the next few months. We're probably going to start seeing just a difference in what the retail storefronts look like. I would say probably starting this month, going into June. So we're going to definitely see some of that. So short-term manufacturing gains. So many U.S. firms cannot ramp up production quickly due to labor shortages, regulation, or infrastructure gaps. So short-term manufacturing gains. So for U.S.-based companies, that if typically I was ordering from China, right? Let's say for my widgets, and now there's a 145% tariff on those widgets. And I can buy the widget that is built here in the United States. It's more expensive, but it's cheaper than me having to pay the 145% tariff. Then as a business owner, I'm probably going to go, I want to continue to be in business. So I don't want to not have stuff. So I'm going to order the more expensive item that's cheaper than the 145% tariffed item I would get from China, right? So even if it's a short-term play, like I'll do this until they figure out the whole China tariff thing. Hopefully they figure that out, right? And then I can start buying from China again. Maybe my mindset, right? So I may go ahead and do that. So those manufacturing companies, they're going to get a bump in business, right? And now it may not be long-term, and they may have capacity issues. So there may be, a waiting list for the things that they need to essentially manufacture. But there could be some gains that happen here. The question is are they going to be able to capitalize and then, essentially retool to be able to become a bigger local manufacturer and maybe even be able to make their things for like more efficiently so they can maybe even sell it for less? Because, a lot of times when you scale, most of the time when you scale your ability to manufacture widgets, the cost per widget goes down. So if that's the case, then you may be able to start selling your wares for less money because you're making more of them. So there may be an opportunity here for manufacturers to, increase capacity so that they can make their widgets for less money. And ultimately what they were charging, they may actually be able to charge less and still be able to, make good margins on there. So if they're doing higher volumes. Now, there's still the capacity issue is logistical. So they still have to build out that capacity. They got to expand their manufacturing plant if they have the physical space to do that. If they don't, they may have to build a new plant or something like that. So there's still logistical challenges that exist here. So we're still looking at like a 2 to 5 year window to be able to, work through that challenge, right? Again, this may be an opportunity for the federal government to support and provide some support to fast track some of that stuff. So I think, if the administration is smart about this is going to be one of the priorities they have, is to help fast track the manufacturing plans to increase capacity as well as to build out new capacity here in the United States. So my hope is that if that's the direction they're going in, they're going to help manufacturing, but it's going to be limited if they're not going to be able to do that. So the con here is that it's essentially a short term, it's limited short term gains because if they don't have the capacity to be able to expand, then there's only so much a business selling a widget will be able to effectively sell their widgets for if it's too expensive, if people are not buying it. So there are some limitations there. So it's I guess the con here is that the gains are essentially, they're limited and they're short term. So can they translate into long-term gains? I don't know if that's going to be the case. I think there's going to have to be some federal support or maybe state level support to be able to fast track some of that in order for that to translate into potential long-term gains. So hopefully they can convert that. I right now it does look like there may be some challenges there. Obviously, retaliatory tariffs, which we're already seeing from China. However, a lot of the tariffs that were put across other nations across the world have essentially been knocked down to, I think we're at 10% now for the most part for most things. There are some exceptions to that rule, but so whether or not, we don't know what the final result is going to be. It looks like India and the United States are talking about zero tariffs across the board. So, if that's the negotiation that's happening, that sounds like that could be beneficial. I would say that arguably more beneficial to India, but definitely beneficial to the United States because then it has a manufacturing partner. It's just a question of time. So, So retaliatory tariffs could potentially have be problematic if we're not able to come to an agreement, with other nations. Obviously, there's a disruption for global supply chains. We're already kind of seeing some of that, especially considering that China makes up almost 30% of all manufacturing. So they are the primary supply chain for most, I would say, a third of all manufactured goods. So if it's not coming through China, then figuring out where I guess leveraging the other 60+% of manufacturers across the world to be able to meet the demand that exists here in the United States as well as in other places. So the question is what is that going to look like? There's going to be that whole shift is going to take time because if China is just great at cast moldings, and that's kind of been their jam, and nobody's really kind of gone into that game because China's kind of dominated that space, for example. Then in order for cast moldings to come out of another place, again, you're back to having to build that capacity in another location. That's a logistical challenge, again, that we're still talking about 2 to 5 years. Now, this disruption began back in 2018, and then we're expected to kind of see that continue going into next year, possibly into 2027. So obviously this is a spike in that supply chain algorithm in terms of like disruption. So hey, let's see how that goes, right? Limited effectiveness without broader trade policy. So the question is whether these tariffs are actually going to be effective, right? So without trade deals or domestic incentives, is kind of what I was talking about before. Tariffs alone don't guarantee manufacturing returns, and this is exactly what I was mentioning earlier, right? So this idea that these tariffs are really just sort of like a tool to kind of get to some kind of hey, let's have a conversation about how we can fix this problem. If trade agreements are not made, then we're still going to be running into problems, and some of that may be retaliatory tariffs on the other side. But ultimately, coming to a deal on how we're going to be doing trade between our nations may be something that it is something that has to be discussed, and we have to come to an agreement on. And it's not to say that tariffs won't exist at all. Maybe there will be certain tariffs on certain things, to protect certain parts of that. So, certain parts of that nation's manufacturing something, right? So maybe that nation is highly dependent on fish exports, as an example, right? And to have, I guess that's not a good one. Let's look at, they're highly dependent on, let's say, textiles, right? They manufacture like materials as an example, and they're highly dependent on that. And a competitor coming in and undercutting their textile industry would be detrimental to their country. Maybe they have a tariff on textiles, but they don't have a tariff on other things, right? So the United States can sell them cars and there's no tariff, but if they're going to sell textiles, then maybe there's a tariff on textiles, right? That something like that would probably be reasonable, because we might have the opposite, right? Well, if you're going to bring cars here, then there's going to be a 25% tariff on cars, but if you build them here, then you don't have to pay that, right? Something like that. But so that at least that's the idea, right? I don't know if that's what's going to ultimately end up come to fruition, but if they can't come to an agreement on what that's going to look like, then these tariffs are going to be ultimately meaningless and just cause a lot of pain for no reason. So it is really critical for trade agreements to be had across the board with all nations that we're doing any kind of real trade with, so that it ultimately has a net positive impact on our country. So these are just some of the things that are really critical for the administration to really make sure that they stay on top of. There's definitely a risk of inflationary pressure. So especially if the tariffs stay in place. Now, if they don't stay in place, then that inflationary, well, it would seem inflationary in the short term. So it'll appear inflationary in the short term because the widget that's coming in is not $10 anymore. Now it's $12, right? And it seems like, oh, it's inflationary, but that $12 is because there's someone at the at the port stamping that it's $2 extra for the widget, right? Not because it costs more for that widget to be manufactured or there's any additional cost related to the widget. It's just there's a person that essentially saying, hey, this is being stamped with this tariff. If that tariff gets removed, then it's back to being a $10 widget. So that's, at least that's the idea. Now, it's very plausible that the $10 widget, now that it's $12, the seller may say, well, I don't have to pay the tariff. Maybe I'll keep it at $12 and see if it works. They could do that, right? They very, very well could do that. Now, this is where competition comes into play. Could a competitor come in and say, hey, listen, I want to be in this game. I don't have the same market share that you have. I'm going to sell my widget at $10 that you're selling at 12. And because my margin is going to be good still, because we both don't have to pay a tariff, and you're just taking advantage of the tariff that was charged before and keeping people at that price point. So there could be competition that can help bring it back down again. Who knows? But yes, the sustained tariffs would definitely have inflationary effects, because then everything is going to be more expensive just to come into the country. And that ultimately means that the materials that come into the country are going to be more expensive, even if they're manufactured here in the United States, because the materials are coming in and they're being tariffed, right? The materials themselves are being tariffed. Then the cost of making the widget is more expensive, because they got to pay more for the materials. So to make the t-shirt, or not, they're probably not gonna make t-shirts, but you get what I'm saying. The materials to make the seats, for example, right? So there is sort of a potential inflationary effect that can happen here with tariffs. So hopefully that the tariffs are more of a strategy, like short-term strategy to negotiate trade deals, as opposed to being a long-term, effectively a band-aid, right? It's not really a solution. But unless you're talking about maybe very specific items that are coming into the country, maybe they may keep some tariffs on very specific items to protect specific industries here in the United States that would ultimately be beneficial to the United States. Steel is a perfect example of that. Like, why we outsource steel so much, I'm very surprised by that, because I think from a national perspective, there is a critical need for us to be able to manufacture steel, because steel is such an important part of it's a building material that we use. It's a material that we use for all kinds of things, and including our military, right? So it's really important for us to manufacture steel. So we should find ways to keep steel manufacturing here, if that makes sense. Semiconductors is another one that I think is really important for us to keep here domestically, because that this is technology is one of the areas where we are really strong in, and we need to make sure that we stay ahead of the game as it relates to that, and don't allow other countries to get ahead of us there, because they're ahead of us in so many other areas. So, we need to find where our niche is. And I think one of our niches is that obviously technology is one of them, and that plays into the military industrial complex, which I have my own issues with. I won't get into today, but that is an area where we do good. We build amazing weapons, which, sad to say, but that is one of the industries where we thrive in, and a lot of that has to do with the technologies that we have here. So the technology that we develop here. So I think technology is an important industry that we need to stay ahead of the curve on. So anything related to technology or infrastructure, we should be making sure that we protect those assets here. So, if we were charging some kind of a tariff for anyone bringing in semiconductors or steel, I wouldn't necessarily have a problem with that, because those industries, I think, do need to have some protection, because we need to be able to build those here and make sure that those industries are able to sustain in the event that we run into any kind of challenges. So, anyways, what we're looking at is domestic manufacturing rebound. Again, we're looking at 2 to 5 years. It could be more than that, right? Consumer pricing increases, which I think will happen probably within the next few months. We'll start seeing some of that export recovery. After the inflation, after the tariffs. I mean, that could take some time, right? That could take a few years as well. Supply chain realignment, again, we're still looking at that same window, 2 to 5 years, to be able to identify other supply chain options outside of China. Inflationary impacts, that could happen within a year or two, depending on how these trade deals ultimately play out. So if the trade deals can work out, then that could be maybe tampered down a bit. So we may not necessarily see inflationary impacts there, but it's still very plausible. And then just sort of the leverage on China, the strategic leverage on China, right? So which is the idea here is just getting China to play a little bit more fair in in the sandbox. I think one of the biggest challenges is they don't play fair, and they don't play fair in a way that is like, oh, they're outpricing us because they're doing it better. They're not playing fair because they are doing things that don't allow anyone else to be able to compete, because of the way that they have sort of a closed system, and obviously they subsidize all their manufacturers, and they just don't allow for the real protection of intellectual property, which makes it really difficult to do business with. Like if you're doing business with someone and they're just going to steal your stuff, it's kind of hard to do business with them. So they've gotten away with it for a long time. I'm surprised that there's so much manufacturing coming out from them, because they've done a lot of knockoffs. People know of knockoffs, and they've kind of like, oh, well, that's just the cost of doing business. But now it's getting really bad. And then, if you're not, if you've not been paying attention, there've been a lot of like direct to consumers from manufacturers selling, knockoff items that they're claiming is the same as what is like essentially what the corporations are sending to them to make. They are just selling it directly to consumers, and they're fully branded items, and they're selling them for pennies on the dollar, which at first sounds like oh my goodness, I can get this widget for a quarter, which sounds awesome, and initially it is kind of awesome. But then what happens is that from a business perspective, right? Like how can businesses can't sustain that. Like that's not something that businesses can sustain. If and it's not to say that businesses have been a good player. Corporations have not necessarily been a good player in this arena either. But I do feel like there's some justification for a business being able to play within a fair market and charge a fair market price. On the flip side of that, I think that a lot of the markets have been manipulated, and what is a fair market price is not, a lot of times, is not real. So, and I think a lot of corporations have taken advantage of the markets, making them not so free. So, and that's part of the reason why you see a lot of people on the left are so frustrated with these tariffs, and who is it really going to benefit and who is it going to hurt, and so on and so forth. And they are just, I think that there's definitely justification to suggest that, yeah, it's, this is going to help, this is going to hurt a lot of corporations, because there's a lot of corporate greed that's happening. So a lot of people are like, well, I don't care if it hurts corporations. And to some degree, I would agree with that. But for the small business owner who's not a corporation, who's just trying to make a living, and not trying to cheat anybody out of things, it definitely is going to hurt them. And a lot of times they get put into the same basket as sort of these corporate entities that are taking advantage of a lot of this stuff. So, anyways, I just wanted to kind of go over some of these things, because I feel like there's a lot of confusion about what's going to happen, how this is all going to play out. People are really worried and really scared. And I think rightfully so. There's a lot of uncertainty as to what's going to happen. How is this going to work? How is this going to play out? How is this going to affect me? Right. Business is slow all around. We're seeing that everywhere. I mean, there are some businesses where that's not the case, but people are being much more attentive to their wallets, and they're not spending as much as they used to. Which is obviously, that our economy is consumer based. So if people aren't consuming, that ultimately affects the economy. And, a lot of the rallies that we're seeing in the stock market is, I think, a lot of that is coming from investors that are looking at the stock market, expecting it to rally back up again, and they're basically buying stuff that is going down. They're trying to buy it at a discount so that when it goes back up, they see the upside of it. And that may very well happen. That may very well happen. It's not a terrible strategy to consider, knowing that the stock market historically has always moved in an upward direction. So, and hopefully that continues to be the case. And, all of this stuff kind of works itself out. But it's totally justified to be absolutely nervous and anxious about everything that's going on. I certainly am. I'm worried about it for different reasons that I hear other people being worried about it. But just, understanding the pros and cons of what this could ultimately mean, I think is important, so that you can kind of at least get a sense of like, okay, there are some positive things that could potentially happen here. So there's maybe some silver lining here. But the con is, and I think the biggest con is of concern, is that there's going to be some immediate pain. And people are going to feel that really fast, really soon. And the question is do they have the tolerance to wait that like window of time? I think that, for these kinds of cycles, we might be able to get away with like another year worth of like, discomfort. Whether we can actually deal with like significant pain, probably not. But if we could get through if we can make it just uncomfortable for a little while, and if the administration is able to somehow make it uncomfortable without being terribly painful, and can come back in 12 months, let's say this time next year, and it's just been uncomfortable, it's not been terribly painful, right? And then this time next year, we see some results come from it. Then maybe, right? Then there's some I think people will be like, okay, it was a little painful, but now we're starting to really see the light at the end of the tunnel. However, if it's super painful really fast, like I think it's going to be, I think that there's going to be a lot of unrest and a lot of frustration from American citizens to change the direction. And there may be enough pressure that, may cause the administration to have to kind of change direction in order to, make this, in order to at least, make it less painful for Americans. Here's the bad news. The bad news is that we're in a $37 trillion deficit, right? That's the bad news. And, with that kind of debt, there has to be some pain that we have to go through eventually, right? That we have to go through to get us back into, a better financial position. And typically that comes from, cutting spending from the government perspective, cutting spending, which oftentimes means cutting jobs, right? Oftentimes. And then the question is what jobs? Because a lot of the cost of those jobs are, I know there's a lot of federal cuts that happen, but a lot of the expenses coming from the state level, right? So, but that would be ultimately cutting jobs, which would be very painful, right? And then, the other way is to increase revenue, and the government makes revenue how? Through taxes. So I know that, the current administration is trying to use tariffs to kind of help subsidize some of that and offset some of the tax burden, from the American citizen. I don't know if that's going to be enough. Hopefully it is. It'd be great if they figured the math on that out. But, obviously, if they're making zero tariff deals across the board with all of these other nations, then, that means that there's not going to be a ton of money going to be coming in. So, the question is where's the money going to come from then? We have to figure out our $37 trillion problem. It's just under 37 trillion, but you get what I'm saying, right? It might as well be it might as well be 100 trillion at this stage, because $1 trillion on its own, $1 trillion is an impossible number to fathom. So we have 37 of them, almost 37 of them, 36 and change. So, the question is how can we cut back on our expenses? How can we increase our revenues? And anytime you do that, think about your own household. Anytime you have to cut back on expenses and you got to increase your revenues, that means that there's going to be pain. There's going to be pain somewhere. That means you're not going to get everything you wanted for Christmas, right? Because you got to cut back on expenses. You're not going to go on that vacation because you got to cut back on expenses, right? And revenue means that for us, for the average working person, means that I got to work more. I got to do a double shift. I got to, do more business. I have to work more. So there's pain that's tied to that. And we're in a bad place right now. As a nation, we're in a bad place where the cost, our costs of running this country has gotten completely out of hand, and it's really a problem. And we got to solve for that. So when are we going to deal with that pain? And the problem is that we either intentionally figure out a way to navigate that, right, through that pain, or it just happens and it just kind of collapses on itself. And while I don't necessarily agree with everything the current administration is doing, the one thing that you can at least give some credit to the administration to is they're doing something, and they're trying to intentionally like make that pain, like they're trying to architect or engineer what that pain is going to look like, right? So that there's at least they can kind of manage whatever that is. I don't know if they're going to be any good at it. They may completely suck at it, but I feel like at least making the intention to say, hey, this is where we're going to feel the pain. We're going to go ahead and feel the pain here, here, and here. Like if you're in your own household, you say, hey, we're not going to do vacations for the next 2 years. We're not going to, do extravagant gift exchanges for Christmas. We're going to do something different, right? That's where we're going to feel our pain, right? Because if we don't do that and we still go on our vacations and we still do the extravagant gift exchange, then later down the line, the only recourse may be I can't pay my mortgage and now we need to move because we are going to be foreclosed on. Like, which pain is worse? Obviously, the second version of that pain is way worse. So I'm thinking about that like at a national level is like we can either structure our pain and deal with it in a structured way, and like we're planning through it, or we can just let it happen at some future time and it's way worse. So I don't like that we have to go through any pain at all, but like as a nation, we're in a bad place and we have to figure out a solution for it. And we're going to have to deal with some kind of pain. And either we can go through some structured version of it, or we can go through the inevitability of it. Like it's happening one way or another. We can either wait for it to just collapse on us, or we can try to structure our way through it. And right now, it seems like the administration is trying to structure its way through it. And I don't know that I agree with all the structure, but I don't have another plan. I don't have another option. I can't think of another way that is going to be any better than what they're doing. So business as usual clearly is not the way, because we're at a $37 trillion deficit because of business as usual. So I can't think of another way. So, I am a critic in that I don't like what I'm seeing, but I don't know that there's anything that I would see considering our situation that I would like. And, the fact that, Donald Trump happens to be the one who's leading the charge on that, I'm not excited about. But we have built ourselves into a trench and we have to figure out a way to get out. And what previous administrations have been doing is trying to dig our way out. But you can't dig your way out of a trench. Like you're already in a trench. You got to get out, right? So how can you figure out a way to get a ladder out of the trench or a rope or something, right? We got to figure out a way out of the trench. So, I mean, that's kind of where I'm at with this. I mean, I'm still very much in a wait and see. I'm trying really hard to be optimistic. And obviously, there's a lot of challenges out there. And I see that there is a potential for this to work out well for us as a country. But the cards are not in our favor. It's not looking good. And it's scary to look at that, right? But there is some pain that we know we have to get through, and we need to figure out a way to get through that pain. And I think that a structured pain, even if you don't like the structure, is better than the pain of complete collapse later. And I think that's kind of where we're at right now. We're in a position where if we don't figure out how to get through the pain, it's going to be collapse, because we can't sustain this. We just can't. As a nation, we can't sustain this. As a household, you wouldn't be able to sustain it. Why do you think a nation would be able to? Like, even the idea of just, I know we have, we can print money. Yeah, that's been done before. And what happens is that that has an inflationary effect, and that can run yourself into inflationary like nowhere land. Like that's not a direction that we really want to have to get into, because if everybody in the world starts to be like, hey, well, listen, anytime the United States has a problem, they're just going to print money, then the dollar is going to become less and less valuable, and that can happen fast, and then other currencies will ultimately take over, and the dollar can turn into poo poo caca. So not a good strategy. So it's a lot. There's a lot going on. You know, pay close attention. You know, follow your wallet. You know, look at your expenses. Look at your income. You know, try to be really mindful of the way that you're spending. You know, I think now is a good time to be super conservative with the way that you spend, while everything's being figured out. There's definitely going to be some pain points. Look for alternative options for you know, how you're going to get, you know, the things that you get, whether that's clothing or food or whatever. Like, you know, don't be afraid of. Listen, I go thrift shopping once a year, and sometimes I'll get some new stuff every once in a while. But most of my clothing is thrift store stuff. So, like, don't be afraid of that. Like, perfectly good clothes in there. You might have to shop a little bit to find the right stuff, but I find some great stuff there. And I mean, I'll get a whole wardrobe for like $150, like a whole wardrobe full of stuff, which is great. So, you know, the only thing I don't really buy at there is like maybe my hats. I don't buy there, and my shoes. But everything else, why not? I mean, maybe not underwear. I probably wouldn't get underwear there. Probably not a good idea. Anyways, you get my point. Anyways, listen, that is kind of our topic for today. I want to kind of get into the pros and cons of what's happening. You know, we're seeing some challenges here in the United States. China's seeing some challenges, you know, in their country. We're seeing some movement as it relates to some of this trade policy, but it seems to be very, very slow. There's definitely pros and cons to how this could ultimately play out. I'm trying to be optimistic on it, so that's my nature. So I'm hoping that it all kind of works out. And if you have any comments or any thoughts on it, I'd love to hear them. Please make sure you comment below and let me know what your thoughts are on this. You know, what's going on in the economy. I'd love to hear any specific topics you want me to kind of chat about or talk about. I'd love to cover them. Make sure you comment below, like, share, and then see you guys next time. Appreciate you guys. Peace.